Let's take a look at the two knights defense. So the Italian game begins e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. If black responds with knight to f6, that's called the two knights defense. In the Italian game, white is pressuring the pawn on f7, and in the two knights defense, white is allowed to play knight to g5 because the knight on f6 is blocking the queen's protection of that square. So now white has two pieces attacking f7, and this particular position is known as the knight attack in the two knights defense. Well, how does black stop this attack? Well, there's no good way to defend f7, so black will block the attack by playing the move d5 to stop the bishop from getting to f7. That's the only way to stop the attack. However, there's one counterattack I'll mention. Black can play bishop to c5. It's known as the Traxler Counterattack. And in this case, white has two moves to consider. Either knight takes f7, forking the queen and the rook, or bishop takes f7 check, forcing the king to move. Both look good, and black's play looks pretty suicidal here. But black actually does get good counterplay, and white has to play very precisely in order to get an opening advantage, although an opening advantage is possible. The computer recommends knight takes f7, I noticed, but I recommend the slightly worse bishop takes f7 check, simply to avoid a lot of theory, a lot of complications. After bishop takes f7 check, this king is going to want to move, and it probably doesn't want to go to f8 and have the rook boxed in. This rook needs to get into the play here on the f file. So the king will come up to e7. Now black is threatening to push the h-pawn to h6 and scare away the knight and then take the bishop. So white should retreat the bishop at this point. And I would put it on d5 here to protect the e4 pawn. So these two are solid in this position, and you don't have to fear knight takes bishop because pawn takes knight, recovers the material and attacks the knight there and gains a tempo, and you're doing fine. Alright, so after bishop to d5, white has a threat. White's threatening to play knight to f7, forking the queen and the rook. So black will normally guard that threat by playing rook to f8. The rook does belong here on the f file if black wants to get any counter chances. Alright, after rook to f8, black is now threatening something. Black is threatening to take the bishop on d5, and after white recaptures, there is an attack on the f2 square. Black can take that pawn. The rook and the dark squared bishop would be attacking that. So to guard against that, white should castle and guard that f2 square with the rook. Okay, after that, black may kick away the knight, or black may play d6 as a common move here to open up the bishop. As soon as this bishop is opened up and has the ability to go to the g4 square, I recommend playing the perhaps suboptimal but very safe h3. Your knight is going to fall back to f3 here after it gets kicked, and you don't want that knight to get pinned. So I think this is the safest way to play, and you do get a modest advantage. I think the computer would probably give this about a plus 0.7 or so. Okay, so after h3, black might kick the knight can fall back, and this position is perfectly fine for white. So this is a good way to avoid all of the theory and all the headaches and all the traps. There are other ways to play you might want to research, but if you take a look at this position, white is up a pawn, the black king is misplaced, and white is safely castled. Black's compensation, however, is better development. Black already has 3 minor pieces developed, and a rook to a half-open file. So it's definitely not just a win for white. You have to play accurately and correctly here. All right, so let's go back. So that Traxler counter gambit is a side line in this knight attack. The main line is to play d5. Okay, so after d5, our bishop is under attack. So we're going to take this pawn. Take it with your pawn. Don't take it with your bishop. That's a mistake. That loses a piece. Knight takes bishop, and the knight on g5 is under attack. So you're going to lose a piece there. So take with the pawn. Now, before I look at that pawn takes pawn, notice this pawn on d5 is guarded twice here, and it's under attack twice. So if we take it, black might reason he can recapture, but he usually doesn't. The main line is to move this knight away to a5, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But let's look at what happens if black does capture d5. His knight is protected by his queen, and his knight still is blocking this bishop's attack on f7, so it looks reasonable. But knight takes d5 allows two strong continuations for white. Okay, one of them is the move d4, which we're not going to look at. It's kind of subtle, but d4 opens up the bishop to guard the g5 knight, which is under attack. And d4 also threatens to open up the position. What we're going to look at is the move knight takes f7, a sacrifice with a colorful name. It's called the fried liver attack. Now that knight is forking the queen and the rook, so black is forced to take it. And here's the point of the attack. Queen to f3 check, forks the king and the knight. So black has little choice but to come up the board to protect the knight. He doesn't want to lose his piece right back again and be down a pawn and have a king wide open. So king to e6 is forced. Now, you don't have to learn a lot of theory to play this fried liver attack well. You just need to remember one thing. As white, your focus should be on the d5 square. Relentlessly attack the d5 square in this opening, no matter what black does, and you should be successful. Okay, so what do you do here? Well, you play knight to c3, attacking it again. So d5 is attacked 3 times, and it's only defended twice. So black needs to defend it again. And the only piece I can see that defends d5 is the other knight. It can fall back to e7, but most players will play it up to b4, which not only defends the knight, but also threatens to come to c2 and fork the king and the rook. But you're not really afraid of knight takes c2. Forget about that. Focus on d5 here. So after knight to b4, knight from c to b4 here, I recommend just abandoning c2 and castling and allow black to take c2. Black can't actually take c2 now because his knight would be lost with check. He still needs to guard that knight. So what black may do is play c6 to guard it further, releasing his b4 knight. Well, then you're still going to ignore c2. Remember, you're trying to focus on getting all your power and energy onto that d5 square. So what piece can come to bear on that square next? Well, this rook. So what we're going to do is try to open the d file and put the rook on d1 and attack d5 again. The way to do that is to play d4 to threaten d takes e5 and open up that d file. And now knight takes c2 is not the best move in the position, but if black does that, open up the d file. And now knight takes rook is a blunder. I'll show you why. That allows exactly what we wanted, knight to d1. It's actually stronger though to take the knight with your knight first. Black will recover with the pawn and then play knight to d1. Notice the pawn on d5 is pinned to the queen here. So black is just completely dead in this position. There's no way to protect d5. It can't move forward, and it can't be protected by any other piece. So white's next move is going to be bishop takes d5 check, and the king is wide open, and we have 4 pieces available to checkmate that king. So we'll end our discussion of the fried liver attack there. It's not a good opening for black. I think black can play it, but he has to walk a very fine line and play it perfectly. So why submit yourself to that torture? So anyway, in this knight attack, after d5 to block this bishop, white takes with the pawn, and black doesn't want to face the fried liver and take back on d5. So instead he moves this knight. This knight is under attack, and he moves it to a5 in the main line. But I want to look at another possibility. Black can move it to d4. Now white should play c3 here to attack that knight, and then black follows up with the counterattacking move b5 here. So both minor pieces are under attack, and that's the point of the knight to d4 move. It protects the b5 pawn. Now white really doesn't want to trade here, so white retreats his bishop. It's best to retreat it all the way back to f1. Don't worry, you're going to get it back out again with tempo. The bishop will come back and take the pawn on b5 and call check as soon as this knight moves or gets captured. Alright, so in this position, I think black's best try is to leave the knight on d4 and take the d5 pawn, unleashing an attack on the g5 knight. White should trade knights, take the knight, allow black to take his knight back, and then take on b5 with check. Now black can play bishop to d7 here. You can trade bishops and draw the king out, or black can play king to d8 and retain the bishop, and then you can castle and you're perfectly safe. Okay, so I think this is a slight edge for white. So let's back up. So again, the knight to d4 is called the Fritz Variation. There is another closely related variation to knight to d4. Remember, after knight d4, black played pawn to b5 next. Well, he can switch the order of the moves. This is called the Ulvestad Variation, b5 right away. Now, if you face that move, play it just like the Fritz Variation. Retreat your bishop to f1. Don't take the pawn, because if you take the pawn, queen takes pawn gives black an initiative here, attacking the bishop. Black gave up a pawn in this line for better development and an initiative. So it's better to retreat the bishop. It's also not a good idea to take the knight and trade it for your bishop. So you retreat your bishop. Now, if the knight comes to d4, then you can play c3, and you've just transposed back into the Fritz Variation, and you can play it just like we said. The only other independent try black might make here is taking the pawn on d5, like queen takes d5, but this allows knight to c3, attacking the queen and the pawn, and the queen will move somewhere like c5, and then you can bring your bishop back out and take the pawn. And then you're doing fine here as well. So white has a slight edge in this position also. Okay, so let's back up to the main line. So again, in this knight attack, d5 is the main line to block the bishop from getting to f7. Pawn takes pawn. And here's the main line move. Knight to a5. Attack this bishop, gain that tempo while you're saving your knight. Okay, white will play bishop to b5 so as not to lose a tempo. Check the black king. Now the main move here, the main line move here is c6 to block it, but there is one independent try, bishop to d7. Now after bishop to d7, don't take the bishop. If you take the bishop, the queen will take back, and you will find your d5 pawn is indefensible. It's attacked twice, it's guarded 0 times, and you can't guard it twice. Playing c4 is not possible because of knight takes c4. So if the bishop blocks, play queen to e2 to guard your own bishop. And then play will probably proceed like this. Bishop to e7 will come next. It turns out knight takes d5 is too dangerous with this king in the center of the board, with queen takes e5 coming. So black protects that e file with bishop to e7. And then white takes time to protect their d5 pawn with knight to c3, and both players can castle. And white is still up a pawn in this position, but this pawn may come under attack and black may try to recover his pawn. But going back to this position after bishop to b5 check, as I said, c6 is actually the main line. This gives up a pawn, for sure. There's no recovering the pawn anymore. White takes, black recaptures, attacking the bishop, and the c6 pawn is guarded by the knight. And there are three normal moves grandmasters make in this position. One of them is bishop to d3, another one is bishop to e2, and a third funny move is queen to f3, pinning the pawn to the rook in the corner. The main line continues bishop to e2. Now, black wants to kick this knight away in a hurry for a particular reason. So black plays h6, and you can retreat the knight to h3. That's somewhat unusual, allowing bishop takes h3 and ruining your pawn structure, but that's a possible way to play. And if you do play like that, look at some master games. There's one that Fischer played, and you can castle, even though your pawn structure is ruined. But the main line is to retreat back to f3, which allows the strong pawn push to e4 here. And this is why h6 was played in a hurry, before white got a chance to push their pawn to d3 to guard against the e4 advance. So you do this in a hurry, the knight falls back, and then you attack the knight. Okay, the best square for the knight is right in the center of the board. And now there are a few moves black can make, but the main line continues bishop to d6 to attack the knight, d4 to protect it. f4 is also possible, but it weakens your king side. And then black takes the pawn en passant, and white recovers it with his knight. So we'll stop the main line there and look at the position. White is up a pawn, but black is already better developed with 3 minor pieces out against white's 2 minor pieces. And white has a slight edge, but black has a wide open board here. So I think there probably are equal chances. All right, thanks for watching the video.